Montana Territory, September 1877, the wind howled down the Bitterroot Valley like it was trying to drag the past out of the bones of the land. Willow Tate stood on the porch of the farmhouse that used to be hers, fists clenched at her sides, skirts snapping around her legs, and watched the wagon disappear down the dirt road with the last of her neighbor's judgment in its wheels. She lost the baby. What use is a woman who cannot keep her own child alive? They had said it in whispers and sideways glances for months. Today they said it out loud. She was 25, childless and alone. Useless, they called her. The wind didn't care, neither did the land. But the folks she had fed during harvests, watched their children during storms turn their backs when her little boy, Caleb, got the fever and slipped away in his sleep. He had only been 3. Her husband had left a year earlier, gone south for cattle work, and never came back. She buried Caleb with her own hands under the cottonwood tree behind the house, wrapped in the quilt she had sewn when she first found out she was pregnant. After that, no one came by, not even the preacher. She had not cried today, not when Mrs. Barnes told her she ought to sell the house to a family with a future, or when Mr. Jenkins offered her half its worth. But now, with her hands shaking and the ache in her chest blooming wide, she went inside, shut the door, and let herself fall to her knees. She did not notice the rider until the sound of hooves came close and stopped. A voice followed. "Ma'am," she stood too fast, heart racing, and reached for the old rifle leaning by the hearth. When she opened the door again, a cowboy sat astride a dark bay gelding, hat low over his brow, dust on his coat, and something quiet in his eyes. "I heard this place is for sale," he said. His voice was deep and slow, not lazy but careful. "Your neighbor said a woman lived here alone." "Thought I'd see 'bout buying," Willow blinked. "You want the house?" He looked past her into the dimness of the parlor, then back. "No, ma'am, I want to rent the pasture. Cattle need space. You've got land, I can pay." She did not answer right away. He dismounted slow, like he knew not to startle her. He was tall, built strong from years of work, and looked to be around 30. His hair was dark, jaw rough with travel, and his eyes green, sharp, steady. "I'm Cassian Pike. Folks just call me Cass." She stared at him. "You do not want the house. Not unless you plan on leaving it." "I am not," he nodded once. "Then maybe we help each other out." Willow hesitated. She had not talked to anyone in weeks. "You can use the pasture, but the water's low and the fence is half down." "I can fix all that," he said. "If you do not mind me around." She stepped aside. "Come in if you want coffee." He looked surprised but followed. Inside, she poured him a cup from the pot she made every morning out of stubborn habit, though she barely drank it anymore. "I buried my son out back," she said without looking at him. Cass held the cup between both hands. "I am sorry for your loss. He was all I had," she said. "People stopped saying his name." "I won't." She met his eyes then, and something shifted in her chest, not healed but loosened. Cass stayed through the fall. He fixed the fence, watered her horse, and mended the shingles on the roof after the first snowfall. He never asked about Caleb again, but he left wildflowers on the boy's grave every Sunday. He never said they were from him, but she knew. One morning she brought him biscuits and found him on the porch with a hammer in one hand and Caleb's wooden toy horse in the other. "I found this in the barn," he said. "It was cracked. Figured you might want it whole again." She took it gently, thumb brushing the smoothed edges. "Thank you." They ate together after that. Not every night, but more and more. She learned he had no family left. Grew up near Helena, worked cattle since he was 15, and never stayed in one place long. "I was not planning to stay here either," he said one night, firelight flickering across his face. "But this place feels different." Willow looked at him. "Different how?" He glanced at her, then away. "Feels like something worth staying for." She did not answer. Her heart beat too loud in her ears. Later, as winter deepened, she found herself humming again while she worked. She cooked more than she needed. And when Cass came in from the cold, she had hot meals waiting. One night, snow blew hard against the windows. Cass knocked the snow off his coat and stepped inside, looking frozen to the bone. "You should not be out in that," she said, taking his gloves. I had to check the fence line, he said. Something got through last night, she frowned. You could have asked me. I can ride. He looked at her then, close. You do not need to prove anything to me, Willow. I am not, she said, voice low. Then let me take care of the hard parts. I can handle myself. I know. But you do not have to. She stared at him, breath catching, and for the first time in over a year, she let someone touch her. Cass brushed his knuckles against her cheek, slow and careful, like he was touching something precious. I am not going anywhere, he said. That night she stood at the window long after he had gone to the barn. Snow kept falling, silent and soft. She pressed her hand against the glass, and for the first time since Caleb died, she believed maybe she would be okay, not the same, but okay. Because someone saw her not for what she lost, but for who she still was. And he stayed. By the time the first thaw reached the valley, the woodpile had burned low and the soil outside grew soft underfoot. Days stretched longer. Geese passed overhead in ragged lines, calling out to no one in particular. Willow began tending the earth again, fingers sinking into cold dirt as she cleared the vegetable rows near the fence line. Her body ached by nightfall, but she welcomed it. It meant things were growing again. Cass spent his days mending the upper pasture, where a section of the hillside had caved inward after the heavy snows. He came back, each evening with dirt on his shirt, and a quiet patience in his eyes that settled her more than anything else ever had. He never asked why she moved slower some days, never asked what the ache in her ribs was when she woke. He just carved a new handle for her hoe without saying a word and left it leaning against the porch rail. One afternoon, as she knelt near the root cellar to check the last of the stored potatoes, she glanced up to find Cass standing near the barn, shoulder pressed to a post, arms folded. You always work alone, he asked. You always watch folks without asking first, she replied, brushing her palms on her apron. He didn't move, just looked at her with that same calm way of his. I was thinking you ought to rest more, she straightened. And I was thinking you ought to mind your own bones before worrying over mine. Fair, he said, then added, still, I'd lend a hand if asked. She stared at him for a beat, then nodded toward the pile of tangled vines she had pulled up. If you're set on being useful, haul those to the compost. The hill's slick, so take the long path. He didn't grin, Cass never did, but there was a shift in his expression, like the corners of his mouth settled into something content. He picked up the bundle without another word. That night, she cooked cornmeal mush with dried berries and a side of salt pork. Cass didn't speak much over supper, but after, he lingered at the table, turning a small tin cup between his fingers. You ever think of leaving this place? He asked. She poured water into the basin, watching it swirl. I used to. After Caleb, I thought maybe I'd vanish somewhere no one knew me, but then I'd wake up and see the cottonwood out back, and I'd know I couldn't leave him here alone. He looked down. I understand. She turned, drying her hands on a cloth. What about you? You ever think of settling somewhere? I did once, he said slowly. There was a woman in Fort Benton. I thought maybe we'd build something. He paused. But she wanted a man with land already, a name. I had neither. Willow leaned against the counter. Her loss. He met her eyes across the dim room. Maybe took me some years to see it that way. They didn't say more after that. She handed him his coat, and he stepped out without another word. But when she latched the door behind him, her hand lingered on the wood. The next morning, a storm rolled in before sunrise. Rain beat down in sheets, and the creek behind the pasture swelled fast. Willow stood at the back window, heart thudding. The last time the creek rose that high, it had taken out half the fence and nearly drowned her mare. She pulled on her boots and coat. Cass was already outside, running toward the lower field. She caught up to him near the bend where the water licked the bottom rail. You've got to open the gate, she shouted over the roar. Let the cattle move uphill, Cass didn't argue. He climbed the rail, boots slipping in the mud. Together they pulled the latch, water rushing around their knees. When the last of the cows cleared the gap, Cass turned to her, soaked to the bone. You all right? She nodded, breath coming fast. He reached out, rested a rough palm over her shoulder. You didn't flinch. Why would I? Most folks would have waited it out. You didn't. She looked up at him. Caleb's fever came on during a storm like this. I waited then. I won't again. He didn't answer. Just kept his hand there a moment longer, then let it fall. The rain didn't ease until evening. They sat by the stove, steam rising off their clothes as they dried. Cass glanced toward the window. You ever think about what comes next? She stirred the fire. You mean after the rain or after everything else? Both. She leaned back, eyes on the flickering flame. I started seeds last week, squash, beans, maybe some summer corn. He nodded slowly. That's a start. She looked at him then, really looked. What about you? You planting roots here? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into his coat and pulled out a small wooden carving, a horse no taller than her thumb, finely shaped. He passed it to her. I made a new one, he said. For your shelf, thought maybe it could stand beside the old one. Her fingers closed around it. The wood was warm from his hand. She didn't cry, but she did smile just a little. You planning on carving more, if you'll let me? She nodded, voice steady. I'd like that. Outside, the rain began to ease. The creek still ran high, but the worst had passed. Inside, the warmth between them held, not loud, not sudden, but steady, like something real. By late April, the cottonwood behind the house budded pale green, and the creek had settled to its usual quiet murmur. The days warmed slow but steady, and evenings brought a hush over the fields that Willow had grown to cherish. It was in that hush that Cass sometimes sat beside her on the porch, neither of them speaking, just watching the light stretch across the land like it had no end. It was on one such evening that she handed him a folded scrap of paper, her fingers brushing his without meaning to. What's this? He asked, voice low, not unkind. A deed, she said, watching the horizon. To a half-acre down by the South Bend, if you're still thinking of staying. Cass unfolded the paper, eyes scanning the ink. You're giving me land, I'm offering it, she said. If you want to build something of your own, a shelter, a barn, whatever suits. He held the paper for a long moment before folding it again. I didn't come here looking for land. I know, she said, voice even, but maybe you want it now. He didn't answer right away. The quiet stretched between them, full but not heavy. Finally, he said, I'd take it, if it means I stay close. She turned her face toward him. Then it's yours. He nodded once, careful not to smile too wide, then tucked the paper inside his coat. The next morning, she found him marking out a line with twine and stakes. He worked without hurry, measuring with the kind of precision that spoke of long years doing hard things right the first time. When he noticed her watching, he tipped his hat but didn't pause. Later, while she boiled lye soap over the outdoor kettle, he came to stand beside her, wiping his hands on a rag. You ever think about teaching again? He asked. She stirred the mixture with a long paddle, the lye stinging her nose. Not since I lost Caleb, Cass nodded. I met a family down by the river fork last week. They got 4 young ones, none learning their letters, said they'd pay if someone take the time. Willow poured the thick soap into wooden molds. What made you bring it up? They asked if I knew anyone kind and sharp. I said I did, she glanced at him. You vouching for me now? I'd put my name behind you, he said simply. She looked down at the molds, steam rising around them. I used to think I was meant to be a mother only. That if I failed at that, I wasn't fit for anything else. Cass leaned against the post beside her. You didn't fail. She didn't speak. He waited, then added, and you're not useless. Not to me, not to anyone who's watched you hold this place together with your bare hands. Willow set the paddle aside. That's not what the others said. They were wrong, he said, voice firm now. They said she was useless for losing a child. But I say she'll never lose me. She turned to face him fully, the late sun catching the lines of his jaw, the quiet truth in his expression. You sure? She asked, not like she doubted him, but like she needed to believe it in her bones. I've never been surer of anything, he said. I've known loss, known what it is to be alone. I ain't looking to pass through anymore. I want to build something here with you. She didn't answer right away, just reached up, touched his collar where the fabric had frayed from wear. Her breath caught, not from sorrow this time, but from the slow, rising warmth of something new and solid taking root. That night he stayed for supper again, and after the dishes were dried and put away, they stood out under the stars without speaking. The wind was soft. The land was quiet. Willow reached for his hand. Cass didn't say a word, just intertwined his fingers with hers. They stood that way until the moon rose high, and when he finally walked her to the door, she didn't let go. Neither did he. There was no need for promises. They were already being kept. By the time the lilacs bloomed, the land had softened to something that almost felt forgiving. Willow stood in the doorway of the small outbuilding Cass had raised by hand, watching him drive the last nail into the frame of the shutter. The scent of new lumber and spring earth mingled on the breeze. "You plan to call it anything?" she asked, brushing her palms against her skirt. Cass stepped back, wiping his brow with the back of his wrist. "Never thought to name 4 walls and a roof. Folks name less," she said, folding her arms lightly. "I had a hen once named Lottie." "Mean as a hornet," he chuckled, the sound quiet but genuine. "Well, if I had to choose, I'd call it earned." She tilted her head. "That suits you." He glanced at her then, not quick but thoughtfully, like he was memorizing how she looked standing there with her hair loose and her chin lifted against the wind. "I hoped it'd suit you too." She stepped closer, the hem of her dress catching on the uneven ground. "You built it with your own hands. That makes it yours." Cass lowered the hammer to the crate beside him. "Maybe, but I built it thinking of someone else, someone I want to share sunrises with and chores. And the dull hours in between." Willow looked up at him, the sky behind his shoulder pale and open. "You asking me outright?" "I am." She studied him for a long moment, her heart steady. "I never thought I'd want that again." "I'm not asking for promises you can't give," he said. "Just a place beside you every day you'll have me." She reached for his hand, calloused and warm. "Then you already have it." They didn't speak after that. They didn't need to. That night she invited him in through the front door, not as a guest, but as someone who belonged. He hung his coat on the peg beside hers. She laid out supper with 2 plates instead of 1, and when he reached for her hand before grace, she let her fingers rest in his without hesitation. The next morning, word reached them by way of a peddler's cart that the schoolhouse in town had lost its teacher after an accident with a buggy. The peddler, a thin, sharp-eyed man with a knack for collecting news, tapped the side of his wagon with one boot. "They're looking for someone steady. Someone who ain't afraid of stubborn children and colder mornings." Willow wiped her hands on her apron. "That sounds like most mornings around here." Cass, standing behind her with a sack of oats slung over one shoulder, said nothing. The peddler raised a brow. "You got experience," she nodded once. "I taught 3 seasons before I married, reading, figures, a bit of geography." "They'll want someone by the end of the week," he said, climbing into his seat. "I'll tell the board you might come." After the wagon rolled off, Willow turned toward Cass. "It's strange. I forgot there were things I used to be good at." "You didn't forget," he said. "You just didn't have reason to remember." She watched the dust settle behind the cart. "You think I should go?" "I think you should do what makes you feel alive again." She glanced up at him. "And if that means I'm gone half the day?" "I'll still be here every evening," he said, "waiting with warm bread or cold cider, whichever you need." The next morning, she saddled her mare and rode into town with her back straight and her chin high. By the time she returned, the sun sat low and golden, and Cass was already in the kitchen, peeling apples with a slow, sure rhythm. She stepped inside, eyes bright. "They offered me the post," she said. "Said I'd start Monday." He set the knife down. "Then Monday you'll teach." She crossed the room and rested her hand on his shoulder. "You always this certain?" He looked at her, something steady and deep in his gaze. "Only about you." That night they walked out past the cottonwood tree. The grave beneath it was quiet, the earth settled. She knelt, running her fingers lightly along the stone she'd placed there the summer before. Cass stood a pace behind, hat held in his hands. "I used to think I'd never love anything again that much," she said softly. "I was wrong." He didn't move, but his voice came sure and low. He'll always be part of you doesn't mean there can't be more. She looked up at him. I know that now. They stood a long while beneath the branches, the hush around them deep and kind. When they returned to the house, she didn't reach for the latch. Instead, she turned to him and said, "Stay." He didn't ask for how long. He stepped through the door beside her, and when it shut behind them, it did so with the quiet certainty of a chapter closing and another beginning. Cass split the last of the spring wood just after sunrise, setting each cut piece in the stacked row beneath the shed eave. The morning was bright but cool, and his shirt clung damp to his back in the places where the axe handle had worn his grip raw. He paused only when he spotted Willow bent at her work table beside the kitchen window, a bundle of dried yarrow and goldenrod spread out before her. He hadn't seen her make tinctures before, not like this, with linen strips laid neat and her face set in the kind of focus he'd once mistaken for distance. Now he knew better. That look meant she was reaching backward and forward at once. He dusted his hands and stepped up to the porch. "You planning to cure the whole valley?" She kept her gaze on the table. "Mrs. Mullen's daughter's teething. I said I'd make something to help with the fever." Cass leaned a shoulder against the frame. "You're not charging them?" "Not for that." She laced the dried stems together, knotting them with practiced ease. "But I've been thinking. There's no apothecary between here and the trading post, and most folks don't have coin for a proper doctor." He crossed his arms. "You want to open up a shop?" "Not a shop," she said, still weaving. "Just a shelf by the door, maybe some jars labeled right. People can leave what they've got: honey, cloth, eggs. Trade for what they need." Cass watched her a moment, then said, "That's more work than teaching." "I can do both," he nodded. "You always did have more grit than most." She smiled faintly without looking up. "You saying you'll help?" "I'm saying I already built your shelf." She looked up then, surprised. "What shelf?" He tipped his hat back. "The one in the hallway, made it from the old barn slats. Figured you'd find a use for it." Willow stood, wiping her hands on her apron. "You built something without asking. You said you wanted room for something new." She stepped forward and rested her palm flat on his chest. "Every day, you do something that makes it harder to remember how I lived before." Cass covered her hand with his. "That's the idea." They stood there in the quiet for a long while, the only sound the rustle of cottonwood leaves behind the house. When the first day of school came, Cass hitched the wagon without being asked. Willow emerged in her gray dress with the pressed collar, hair pinned in a tight twist at her neck, and a satchel over her shoulder. She paused at the edge of the porch steps. "You sure you don't mind the drive?" "I'd drive you to Missouri if you asked," he said, holding out his hand to help her up. The ride into town was quiet, the road still muddy from last week's rain. When they reached the schoolhouse, a cluster of children stood huddled near the door, their eyes wide and curious. Willow stepped down with practiced ease, adjusted her bag, and turned to face him. "Will you be here at 3? "I'll be here before the last bell rings." She leaned in, then paused. "I never thought I'd have this again. A place, a purpose, someone to come home to." Cass touched her cheek just once. "You've had it. Took you a while to see it was already yours." The months that followed were steady and full. Willow taught 6 days a week, and on Sundays she and Cass walked to the river bend, where they'd planted a row of saplings to mark the edge of his land and hers. The trees were small still, but they grew fast, roots tangling beneath the surface toward one another. She kept her jars on the hallway shelf: elderflower, comfrey, beeswax from the Andersons' hives. Sometimes people came by with baskets, sometimes with nothing but a story and a need. She never turned them away. Cass built a henhouse behind the barn and a smokehouse beside the well. He started with a few cattle, then added 2 milk goats and a draft horse he called Finn, whose left ear folded in half like a dog's. Every evening, he met her outside the schoolhouse with a thermos of coffee or a slice of pie, depending on what the day called for. One evening, after the last frost had passed, Willow found him in the garden, knees in the dirt, coaxing a stubborn row of carrots. She crouched beside him, brushing soil from her sleeve. "You ever think about a wedding?" she asked, not looking at him. He tilted his head. "You asking?" "I'm saying if we're going to spend our days side by side, we might as well let the law catch up," he chuckled. "I'd have married you the first time you handed me coffee." She nudged his arm. "Don't make it something sweet, I want it real." He looked at her then, eyes clear. "Then we'll do it in our field, after the beans come up. No preacher unless you want one." "I just want you," she said. They married in June. A circle of neighbors gathered under the wide sky with wildflowers in Willow's braid and Cass in his cleanest shirt. They signed the paper on the porch rail, and afterward shared blackberry pie on tin plates while the sun sank behind the cottonwoods. That night, as they lay beneath the quilt she'd made long ago, the house quiet around them, Cass traced the line of her shoulder and said, "You still think you're not meant for more?" She turned toward him, eyes soft in the dark. "I think I was waiting for you to remind me." The seasons passed. The schoolhouse filled. The garden flourished, and under the cottonwood where her son rested, they planted a patch of blue flax that bloomed each spring without fail. They never left the valley. Never needed to. Everything they'd lost had taught them how to hold what they had, and they did. For all their days.